button. We are live.
All right, there's a red light. That seems legit. Cool. All right. Well, thanks for having me, guys. I am the social science data curation specialist, which is a big title at the University Libraries. Yeah, I guess I'll probably talk about a little bit about why I exist as a position, just broadly, academic libraries are starting to get into sort of data management as sort of people who are used to organizing, preserving, and making accessible information. So they sort of have an interest in this research data management sort of game. All right, so what is data management? And I guess I should say that like research data management is what I'm going to be talking about versus data management, which oftentimes businesses refer to like sort of like database management. That's not what I'm going to be talking about. Instead, I'm going to be talking about sort of these practices that you engage in across the life cycle of a research project. So before you begin, while you're collecting and analyzing your data, and then once the project has been completed. And ideally, what we want is those practices, you engage in them in a way that ensures the integrity of the data, facilitates replication, protects the data from loss or potential breaches of confidentiality, right? And through these practices, ideally, you will become more efficient and your research will be more reliable. But really, what is data management? Because that was all pretty theoretical. So it's really kind of thinking about and planning for the management of your files, as simple as file naming and folder structure, talking about documentation, metadata, also thinking about storage, backup, and security of your data, and also potentially sharing and definitely preserving your data. You want to think of your data as something that you want to create a record of throughout your career. Right. All right, so why should you care about data management? Well, you may be asked to care. So various funding agencies, including the NSF and NIH, have required data management plans for grant applications. Additionally, the Office of Science and Technology Policy issued a memo in 2013 that said any federal granting agency that issues more than $100 million in grants has to provide for some data sharing policy for their fundees. And then finally, oftentimes journals will require you to share your data, and some societies are sort of expecting to have data sharing and open data as being a good practice in science. So like ideas of verification, transparency, and replication as being part of what it means to be a good scientist, right? So there are various sort of ways in which you may actually be asked to share your data, or that you may want to prepare your data in the eventuality that you may be asked to share your data, right? All right, why else should you care? Well, it's kind of in your own interest. So you're probably going to save time by employing some of these practices, by having thought through some of these things. You also potentially may get more citations from it. So there was a study done on actually publications in cancer research, and they found that authors who provided well-detailed data got more citations than those who did not, controlling even for impact factor. And another way of thinking of increasing citations is one of the things that is sort of emerging as an idea is that data is in of itself a research product that has value and should be sort of seen that way versus as a means to an end. So I think traditionally academics approach data as being the way that I get a journal article or the way I get a book. But actually well-constructed data, well-documented data is a research output that has value in and of itself, especially if you can reuse it for teaching, or if someone can inventively sort of reincorporate it into another study. You put a lot of time into collecting that data, right? So it makes sense for it to be recognized, especially if you've done a really good job. And there is kind of a movement to try and get data citations as a normative thing, and consider data citations as a impact sort of factor, even when looking at tenure. That hasn't like picked up a lot, but that's certainly something that I think the people who are interested in this open data movement are trying to push towards. And then finally, I've kind of already touched on this, that by engaging in these practices, you are sort of demonstrating your integrity as a researcher by taking steps to ensure that your data is easily replicable, well documented. So if someone wants to examine your data or questions its veracity, you are saying, I've taken all the steps I can in order to guarantee that someone else can look at my data, understand it, replicate it, and I've documented all of my steps, right? All right, so one more why you should care. So let's imagine in the future, you're 3 years out of completing your PhD. Congratulations, guys. Someone contacts you and you're like, oh my God, your dissertation was brilliant and the associated publications. I would love to reanalyze and replicate one of those studies. So, do you know where those files are? Can you still access them? Were you working in a lab and you did all the work on the lab computer and now you've left the institution and all your data is still on that lab computer? Can you even open them? So do you even have the copy of the program where you're using the department's software to use that, and someone's asked to look at it and you want to look at it first, can you even open them? And then finally, do you have any documentation that you can provide to them if they want to be able to understand the data? It's one thing to have the data, but it's another thing to be able to actually use it and understand it, right? So have any of you guys ever asked for and used someone else's data and opened it up? Yeah. Did you have to then contact them and be like, can you explain what these variables are?
Yes.
Yeah.
After they hassled and tried to figure it out first.
Yeah, right, exactly. So that's what often happens is, you're like, thank you for your data, now can you please explain why this variable is named V3A2, But the thing is, depending on how long ago the study happened, they may not know why it's named that, right? So we want to avoid that, right? All right, so broadly, this is what we're going to be covering today, which is a lot, guys, I'm going to be honest with you. So I'm going to go with a fair clip. I failed to mention, but I hope you did notice, there was a Z-link on the first slide, which is a link to these slides. And that is z.umn.edu/DM for data management.
Slow down.
Yep, sorry. Yeah, so it's a Z-link, so it's z.umn.edu/DMepsyCC. That's what you, right? The ESPOI, that's and then CC. So that's data management, it's computing and conversations. Yeah, sure. Sure, it's, I'm sure it'll get sent out. So it's z.umn, and then I'll write this really big because this is the important part.
Okay.
Sorry. Alright. So we're going to be covering a lot. So I apologize if we go through it quickly, but and there's also going to be links that I've embedded in some of the slides so you can follow up on some things as well. So I'm really thinking of these as being sort of note-taking sources for you guys. All right, so I hope you guys can see this. Do you guys read PhD comics?
Yep. Yeah.
It's painfully real sometimes. It's too close to the bone. All right, so how many of you guys have ever named a file final? Right? Yeah. Was it the final version of that? No, it definitely wasn't, right? So what we want to do is be proactive about thinking about how we're actually going about naming our files, right? So there's some general sort of rules that are good. So number one is you want to be consistent, right? When you think about how you're going to be naming your files for your research, number one is thinking about being consistent and also thinking about how sorting comes into play, right? So your computer is going to be sorting things alphanumerically, or you can sort by type, right? Which is also can be very useful. So you're like, you know what, I need to see all of my Excel files. Boom, you can get them all. Depending on how they're named, they may line up really nicely. Next, you want to be descriptive, right? So if you name something very quickly, just did this interview.txt. You go back in 2 weeks, and you're like, great, now I have 3 files named interview.txt 1, 2, and 3. What are they? So instead, you want to think about what is the pertinent information that you're going to need to know as you're looking at these files. So in this case, I had the date coming first, so that may not make sense. And then there's an interview, what site it was at, and what the respondent's sort of identifier was, right? you could also arrange this so if you are more interested in the fact that it was an interview, you can put interview first. That way you'll get all your interviews lined up next to each other versus all of your archival research, something like that. But you want to think about when you are going to analyze your data and review your files, what is going to be the most pertinent information you want to be able to sort by, right? And similarly, you don't want to embed any information into folder structures. So here you can see we have a folder named 2015, a folder named August, a folder named Minneapolis, a folder named interview. There's a lot of folders. A folder named interviews, and then reaction memo.txt. So if reaction memo.txt got moved accidentally out of that folder, you would lose all of this information. Ideally, you'd have that information within the file, but you'd have to open it up to find out, right? So you don't want to embed sort of important descriptive information in the folder structure. Or you want to replicate it, right? So maybe you want to organize things by site. You have a field site in Minneapolis, you have one in St. Paul. You could divide your folders by Minneapolis and St. Paul, but you probably want to also put that into the file name itself. So if it gets out of its Minneapolis folder, you still know it's a Minneapolis interview or a Minneapolis data set, right? All right, just a small but still important. When you write dates, the international standard is 4-year, 2-month, 2-day. This way, when you organize your files, it will always organize chronologically. If you did month, day, year, and you have multiple years, it's going to organize May of 2014, May of 2015, May of 2016, right? But if you do it year, month, date, it'll always organize in the correct chronological order. So that is the way to go. And then also you want to think about, if you're going to be dealing with multiple versions of things, to have leading zeros, right? So if you know you're going to have maybe 50 versions of something, you want to have a leading zero for your first one, right? Does that make sense? All right. Any questions about this? All right, great. Next, these are just 3 sort of ways that you can organize folders. And really, it comes down to what makes the most sense for your project and how you're envisioning your project, right? So these are just some ideas of how one could organize all of the data related to one's project. But ultimately, what should happen is you guys should think about what are the most important key things for your project, how do you want to organize them, and what works for you. Like all the data management in the world is not going to work unless you actually use a system that you've put together, right? So it has to make sense for you. All right. All right. So you've got a plan for your files. You go out. You're collecting things. What should you document? So broadly, you definitely want to document when and where and how the data was collected. You want to document any sort of decisions you've made, right? Experimental or otherwise. Like what kind of recruitment did you do? What kind of sampling did you do? How did you create your codes, right? Also, any kind of statistical analyses that you've done, you want to document that. If you've used any sort of software, you want to note what kind of software it is. You want to say where your data and documentation are stored, right? And also, a good idea is also to note down future research ideas or plans for your data. Additionally, this is just like a great sort of tip that a colleague of mine told me. And she said that what she did when she first started her doctoral program was she had just a plain text file. And as she was reading articles, as she was working with her data, she came up with all sorts of ideas or like things that she could follow up on, research questions, these kind of things. And she just dumped them into this text document as soon as she had them while she was like sort of in the process of doing that. And then when it came time for her to figure out what to work on for her dissertation, she had a document full of various ideas. Probably some of them weren't great, but some of them had like a kernel of something, right? So that might be a good sort of practice as you guys, especially if you're earlier on in your careers, to like have a file where you just like dump in any kind of idea. It's just for yourself, right? And then later you can go and like look through those and see if there's anything that's like worth following up on, right? All right. So how should you document it? These are sort of 4 common methods, I think, for documenting data. We'll go through these. All right. So a research log or a README file. So what we're talking about here is kind of, a README file can in some ways be the answer to all of those questions that I posed earlier. But generally you can just think of a research log or a research diary or a README file as being a central location where all of this sort of information is sort of captured, right? Including like where you can find your files, sort of the motivation for your study, your sampling frame, any of those kind of things, right? Have a central location where all of that's captured. And I'm sure it'll make writing your methods portion of your dissertation and or a journal article way easier, right? And you want to document as you go, right? While it's fresh in your mind. I like to joke that in some ways I just put the fear of research data loss in people, and it's like, I pretty much am just like, don't trust yourselves. You will forget. That is the moral of the story. So, yeah, so one strategy is to have this centralized location where you just dump all of this sort of information, right? Another thing that you guys want to be documenting if you work with any sort of statistical methods is you want to record your analysis with a syntax file. So SPSS, you can use the drop-down menus to sort of put together whatever sort of analysis you want to do, and instead of hitting OK, you can hit paste and then pop out your syntax file, and you can then save that. This is, I think, especially important in SPSS because if you don't sort of record the output from it, it's very easy to sort of make changes to the data and then not have a sort of trail to know what changes might have happened, right? So if you get in the habit of copying the syntax file and having the syntax file, you'll always be able to retrace your steps. Similarly in R, you want to save your written scripts. Also, you could consider using a Markdown or a SweeveKnit R to keep output and your scripts together. A big thing is making comments in your syntax. This is essentially like a combination sort of research analysis and documentation. So in order to do that in SPSS, you can just use an asterisk and then close it with a period. In R, you just start the line with a hashtag. And you can create a lot of white space in your syntax file so it's easier to read. And I'll show you guys two examples of that. But this is a really useful sort of tool for keeping track of what you're thinking as you're running your analyses, right? So if you're like, let me try this, write in why you think that was important, what you ran, right? As a comment within your syntax. And then the next time you like open up your data and you run your syntax to get your data back to where it was, you can review it and see what changes you've made and what your rationale or the idea behind it was, right? Yes?
So the comment in SPSS is just started with an asterisk, then you type whatever, and then you enter the period?
Yes, correct.
Thanks.
Yeah. Super useful. And then Mantra is the University of Edinburgh's data management training sort of module. And they have some data handling tutorials in there. It may be for some of you guys like super basic, but there's some little nuggets of good advice within those that I would recommend. Okay, and so I'm just going to show you some examples. So here's an example. So I work as also as the social science data curator for the data repository that just got launched here. And so me and one of my fellow curators were putting together this SPSS syntax file to send to a faculty member because we needed more information about their data set. And so what my colleague did was create this syntax file. You can see all the comments that she made, and she used the commenting to create sort of formatting and spaces. So it's really easy to read, but you can run this syntax, and we can, like, once we confirmed that these were actually the variable labels, then we can just run this syntax and have sort of a record of why we asked or what was going on. All right, so that's an SPSS example. Here's an R example of sort of creating space to make it more sort of user-friendly to read. This is actually a template, which I've created a link to here. But you can see the hashtags are being used, and these are the command lines, right? To create that sort of space and make it a little user-friendly to read. All right. Yeah, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. So, and sorry, I might have missed the boat on this.
Oh yeah, sure.
Is it so in the database and stuff? You're storing more than data sets. You're storing this too, like the analyses and all this stuff in your guys' big database as well.
You mean the data repository?
Yeah, the data repository.
Oh, that particular syntax file is probably going to be in the back end. It's not going to be like public facing.
Okay.
So like it'll be a part of our curatorial records.
Okay.
That, like, so we have like a back end sort of memo that we create for each of the submissions that we get, and it's like I asked about this, I changed this, like that. So this will go in that
Okay.
as a record for us to have a trail of what we did.
I see.
Yeah, but that's not going to be like that's not going to be public facing
Great.
by any
Thank
means.
you for clarifying.
Yeah,
that.
no, definitely
Yeah.
no. I wouldn't want that
Right.
impression to be.
Right. So
Yeah.
that the tips that you just gave, they were like for our personal practice.
Personal practice, yeah.
Right. Not like you need to do this with your data so that when we put it in our
No. Although this particular template could very easily be outward facing because it's sort of set up as sort of like you can see here this contact information and like this is like related to a publication is the way the template is written.
Yeah.
So you could create a syntax file that would be outward facing,
Got it.
but you probably will end up doing one for yourself and then modifying it if someone wanted to look at your syntax, I
Right.
would think.
Perfect.
But I think that it's more for yourself than anything. And then if there's a reason why you need to collaborate with someone or a publication wants you to submit that data, then you can tidy it up and like remove all of the like, oh, why did I try that?
Yeah.
You know, comments that you may put in there.
Yeah. Got
You're
it.
like, dead end, start again, you know, any of that. It can probably be, does not need, it's the personal researcher sort of thing. It's like Julia Child, right? You guys are in the kitchen and only you know what's going on in the kitchen, right? The cook is the only one who knows, yeah.
Can I ask another
Sure.
question about what you said about the folders?
Oh yeah, the
Before?
folder structure, yeah, sure.
Like, I don't know if you can help with this, but what usually happens is I start making modifications on the file, and then I just create a new file, and I say version 2.
Yep.
And then version 3, and then I have like 1,000 versions of those. But I do this because I don't want to lose any information that I modified earlier.
Right.
Do you see this done in a better way?
So I'm going to talk a little bit about versions a little bit later, but if everyone's okay with spoilers.
I can wait if you can.
No. Let's talk about it. So there is no good answer apart from you should think about what versions are actually needed to be kept. So you can think of them as like milestone versions and then delete the rest. So another component of good data management is also like reducing the amount of data that you have. So if you have 100 versions of something, like you should decide which versions you think are sort of like important milestone versions to keep, delete the rest, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, and so that will be on a slide coming soon. All right. Any other questions? Okay, great. All right, so data set metadata, and so like this is like if you're working in a program like SPSS, there's a lot of metadata that you can enter into that program, right? And so when you're thinking about that, you want to have sort of short but descriptive variable names. I know there are a couple like no-go variables that you can't, or excuse me, letters or characters you can't use in SPSS. I think like the $sign and the @ you can't start a variable with or have in the variable because it has other meanings. A big thing is you want to fill out the labels in SPSS, right? You think you'll remember, you won't remember. That's going to be the recurring theme today. Oh yeah, and especially if it's derived, if you're creating an index or if you've recoded or combined variables, you want to not let the variable name that's probably only like 10 characters at the most carry that weight. You want to put that in the variable labels, right? And then the other thing which you can get really lazy about is assigning values. Also super important. Sometimes, sometimes data sets that you're reusing might have really non-intuitive ways of assigning their values. So like, it could be 0, 1, but like 0 is yes and 1 is no. Whereas like we probably, because we think of no as being negative, we want to think of a 0, right? Like, so you definitely want to make sure that you fill in those values. Also, if you're using Excel, similarly you want to create a lot of documentation, right? You want to make sure you have column headings, at the very least. And if your rows have any sort of meaning, right, like you want to include that. Any sort of like modification that you make to the Excel file, like abbreviations or variable names, ranges of variables, you want to note somewhere, right? You want to note if any formulas are happening, and if you have any modifications. So like How many times have you looked at an Excel file and been like, why is that column there? What are those numbers? I have no idea. So you want to like make a note. Sometimes I just use another sheet within the Excel file. I just use it as my sort of like research log, and then it's bundled together, and everything's there, and I can review it before I start working with the data again, right? Similarly, you can also put in there like what to follow up on. Like, oh yeah, that's why those cells are yellow. Right? How many times have you opened up an Excel file and you'd be like, those numbers are red and it's only 3 of them. Why? Why? Right? Because you won't remember. You won't remember. So we want to like nip that in the bud, curtail that. Yes?
So how do you, what's your suggested way of like noting formulas or like making sure that people know where the formulas are?
Yeah, that is a great question. I'm not sure if I have an answer for you. I know I think there are various tools that you can maybe like extract them. Alternatively, you could just document them like as a plain text. You know what I mean? Like make the cell like a text, so then you can put in those like if you have like a documentation sheet like I've been using. I don't even know if that's the best way to do it. That's just what I've been doing. Yeah.
Yeah, what I usually do when I use Excel and I have to use formulas, I make a copy of that sheet. And then for each formula, I just write before the formula apostrophe or
The single quote mark to give the
exactly.
text.
Yeah. So then here I will have whatever I have, but here I have description of all
Perfect.
these formulas. So I don't know if that works.
See? There you go. Crowdsource the perfect answer. That's great. That's great. Yeah, no, I often will suggest like, to when I was in grad school, I often like would just ask my peers, because I think a lot of what happens in graduate school is you don't necessarily get any formal education about this. It's kind of very trial and error. You might get a little piece of file management when you take a methods class or when you're talking to your advisor or something like that, but you don't get any sort of like really structured education about that. So I oftentimes would end up just asking my peers, like, what are you guys doing? And more often than not, they'd be like, well, I did it this way, and don't do it this way, right? So, thanks.
Yeah, and additionally, I remember, but I'm not really sure, that Excel has an option, something like track or something.
Yeah.
And then if you have a formula, you are using cells from here, and from here, and your formula is here, and you just click on track, it will show you how they are related and how they fit in your formula.
And then I also, I just remembered, there's also some sort of functionality which I haven't played with yet, where you can lock cells or sheets so that people can just view it, but they can't actually modify it. Which might be, depending on like who you're sharing your data with, or something might be something you want to do. But you can just Google that. That is definitely Googleable. I don't have a slide for that, sorry guys. Okay, so yeah, long story short, put in your metadata, use the functionality that is embedded, and or just create it yourself in Excel. Okay. And then finally, the last one we talked about was code books. So this is just some guidelines if you're creating a qualitative code book. So I'm actually more of a qualitative sociologist by training, so I lean qualitative. If you hadn't noticed, many of my examples are kind of qualitative-y. I will say, just to point out that of these, so in my dissertation I did content analysis, and I would say like creating guidelines for when to use the code and when not to use the code, and including examples, is so important. You think that like a detailed description will do it, but there's always going to be a borderline case, and then you're going to be like, crap, and then you have to go back and look at all the things you coded as what it could be, code A could be, and then go back and look at what code B could be, and then make the decision. So you want to like be more efficient, right? So having that really detailed description, the rationale behind the code, what's included, what's excluded, and continuing to add examples as you go, right? There's no limit on how much documentation you can create for yourself, right? Is really, really important, I think, if any of you are going to be involved in like sort of qualitative coding. Okay, and then quantitative code books is going to be very similar to our conversation that we had about creating sort of data set metadata. So have any of you guys like used other people's data or downloaded data from like ICPSR, and ideally it came with a code book, hopefully, right? So you guys have some familiarity then, but generally you want to include the variable name, the values, the labels. If there was a question, like if it was a survey, or if there was an instrument that produced the information, you definitely want to note that. If the variable was created by recoding it, or it was combined with another variable, or maybe it was top-coded because you're trying to minimize sort of security risks, right? You want to note that. Generally, codebooks have sort of a few descriptive statistics, possibly the n's, percentages, or means, right? And then definitely, if and how missing information is coded. So is that blank space because the question wasn't asked, or is it because they refused to answer, or is it because, like they just, that question just didn't exist? I don't know, right? You want to know why there is any missing information. Right? Cool. All right. So next we're going to talk about collaboration. I know I'm going at a rapid clip, guys. I appreciate it. So when you're collaborating with people, it's really important to assign clear roles and clear procedures for how you are going to work as a team. And I think the biggest thing is coming up with some way to communicate changes or modifications about what's going on. So one strategy is to like set up a central location. So for example, we all have Google Drive, right? Like you could all have a Google Sheet or a Google Doc, which you all work in and do all your planning in, right? Additionally, I know in the Google Suite, you can actually like assign comments when you comment on something to a particular user. So you just use the plus sign and start typing in their email address, and then they'll be essentially notified of this comment, but not everyone has to be notified of the comment. So that could be really useful if you're going to go that route on a collaborative project. Alternatively, you could just set up a system where any changes that happen are systematically reported. So at the end of the week, everyone could be like, these are all the things, this is all the coding I did. I finished this many interviews. I made this modification to the code book. Like, everyone please review that before you continue coding, right? Something like that. And again, we come back to versions here. You want to come up with clear protocols about versions. And if you guys are working on multiple versions of the data and then are going to be like recombining them, you need to figure out like a way to do that where data isn't accidentally overridden. Like, come up with a strategy for that, right? And then a good idea is also to think about who's going to be responsible for the security and storage of the data and for how long. So if you get into a group project, maybe one of those things where like, oh great, the project's over, and then whoever was hosting the data kind of just, everyone just like, oh yes, we did so well on that project, and that person is just sort of now unofficially the steward of that data, right? So you want to make that clear, and I think most often than not, it's, it's probably whoever's hosting the data, right, offers their institutional resources, will also probably want to take on this responsibility for long-term preservation. Or be like, someone else needs to do this. Someone else needs to buy 100 gigs in Amazon or something for this. Although actually Amazon's probably not a good space for research data. Now that I've said that.
Are we going to talk about what good spaces for research data is?
Yeah, I have a slide on it.
Woo!
Yeah, very exciting, very exciting. And then also, I just want to mention this resource. So Open Science Framework is an open source online collaborative tool. It's designed for researchers, and I think in their language they talk about it as being a public good produced for researchers to facilitate collaboration. And there are other types of collaborative tools like Trello, Basecamp. There's loads, and many of them have free versions with like limited functionality. So that's also an option, as a centralized space for you to be collaborating on projects. But the reason why I highlighted this one is because it is sort of for researchers. So check it out. I mean, again, whatever you do, it has to just work for you and it has to be intuitive. So that may not be the best answer, but certainly one to check out. Alright, cool. Alright, here's our version control slide. So, it's gonna be eerily similar to some of our previous slides, but yeah, so you definitely want to list your versions alphanumerically, right? And think about how many versions you might be creating. And then you want to decide how many of those you want to keep, and also like when, and if you're collaborating with other people, who is going to be deleting versions. Generally, you want to create a master version, and then like identify milestone versions to keep. You want to put all of them in one location. And then if you're working at a team, you want to assign the responsibility of that to one team member. So you only have one person who is sort of deciding when, or in collaboration with you, deciding when documents are going to be deleted, which documents to save.
And so, can you describe this concept of a master version?
Yeah, so by that, I think what we're talking about is sort of, if you're working on a team, potentially someone, like all four of you can have a version of the data, right? And be working on it and playing with it, right? But there might be like a master version of the data, which is like, okay, we've cleaned the data, we've created the variables we think are important. Now each of us are going to do separate analyses, but using the same data.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So like I was speaking with a political scientist a couple weeks ago, and he was talking about starting a project, and essentially that's what he told me, is that like they are combining, they did a bunch of surveys of their different campus sites, and they're combining all those results, so same instrument, different sites, they're all going to be doing their own projects, but they sort of all pitched in to create the data. So in that case, like they would want to have like a master version of the data, if anyone were, and you kind of like, I mean that's a good practice, I think, to have that kind of like, before we go any further, this is like where we're all working from, kind of idea. And something to think about for yourself too, possibly, yeah.
Alice, do you have any recommendations for like you've been saying, like you won't remember, so like just a system for like marking the versions that are landmark versions, or like going back, or do you have any tips or systems that work for you that you've heard about?
I mean, I think you could literally just put the word master version, or like master or milestone in the file name.
Okay.
You know? And then you can also create documentation, even if it's just like a document file, or your syntax file, like illustrating, like, you know, being like, these are the differences between this milestone and either the previous one or the master.
Yeah.
Right?
Cool.
So then you create that sort of trail, right?
Amazing.
Any other thoughts, guys? All right. I kind of already mentioned this, I think, did I? No, I just talked about collaboration. So all of the Google products have this great C revision history option, which is really great. So this is an option for you if you are working with teams to sort of see when changes are made, all that, and it just happens automatically, which is super convenient. Also, in Word, obviously there's like track changes, which is super useful, but there's also this option to compare two versions of a document, and this is super useful if you say you've not followed all of my advice about file naming, and suddenly you have 4 files, and you're like, which one of these is the most recent file? And all of them I opened up accidentally, and so the last time it was opened is now not a good indication. And, so what you can do is you can go in and compare 2 versions of the document, and it opens up 2 panes, and then it'll show all the different changes between the 2 documents as track changes. And then you can go through and either accept or reject them. And you have an option to either have those changes go into a new document, or have those changes go into one of the 2 documents that you've opened. But I heard this terrifying tale of someone who said that his advisor didn't use track changes and just gave him comments in his Word document. So he had trouble finding the comments.
Yeah.
And so I was like, this is going to solve your problems. Also, teach your advisor how to use track changes. That's the other solution. But super great sort of, if you have MS Word, tool and you're uncertain about which is the most recent version or something like that. It's super useful. In my case, like, you know, it's how you avoid that, like, final, use this one, final, no really, you know, sort of stuff. And there's a link here to walk you through it, too. Yeah?
Do they have to have the same name in order for you to be able to use this compare feature?
No, you just pointed at whatever two documents you want.
Great.
Yeah, and so I haven't done this, but I imagine if you pointed at two documents that don't have any overlap, it'll just show everything as P. That'd change, maybe, I don't know. That would be my guess.
This has saved my butt a couple times.
Yeah, so yeah, there we go. Proven track record. Great.
This talk is changing my life.
Alright, so here's my secure data storage slide. Alright, so generally if you have any protected health information or sensitive identifiable data information, you want to keep that either in an encrypted drive or like folder on net files, which is going away, so don't bank on that too much, but it's going to be replaced with something. They just don't know what yet. OIT block storage, or if it's something that needs to be like HIPAA compliant, which is like super sensitive, the Academic Health Center has servers that are HIPAA compliant. However, if you have de-identified data, you can put that on your University of Minnesota drive. So,
and so by Google Drive, you mean
the Minnesota. I mean, not your personal drive. So the University of Minnesota has negotiated a specific sort of user agreement with Google that your personal Gmail is not governed by. So it's safe for this de-identified data. You can also put it on a shared personal drive and then all the way up.
But it needs to be de-identified.
De-identified, correct.
Okay,
Yeah.
so okay, because I asked some questions of OIT about the Google Drive issue.
Yeah.
So.
What did they say?
Well, I got first of all that this is a couple years ago, and it seemed like it was one person who was at the bottom of the hierarchy, like begging for information when nobody knew what was going on.
Yep.
I
know that feeling. Go on.
Okay. But the impression I got was that, well, that what that person told me was that Google Drive, you could put FERPA data there.
Yeah, I've heard wildly different things myself.
Okay.
So this slide is based on one of my colleagues is actually on like one of the OIT like work groups.
Okay.
And she's the one who told me this, but I went to like the Academic Health Center's webpage and they were like, oh yeah, Google Drive's fine for like sensitive information. And I was like, what's going on?
Okay, so the university has not been consistent on this.
I think that they have, they do have various policies and sort of information on that, but I would say if you want a definitive answer to maybe just contact them directly.
Well, I work for Carrie, and we're having a meeting with some OIT people and some different people on Monday where we're trying to hash actually this specific issue.
I would love to
get
the cliff notes.
I'll
on
loop
that.
you guys.
Yeah,
I'll loop you guys in. So it's not clear right now. And am I also seeing like identifiable data can't be on a like university shared drive? Is that also true?
I think that the shared drive is what we mean by like net files and block storage. I thought.
Oh, okay.
I think this is like, that's a great question. I just assumed it was like a personal thing. Yeah.
I think that's the OIT block storage.
Okay, so when we like the CEHD
mistake.
drives and stuff, we can because we have so much
sure.
data.
I know,
Everybody's got data there. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that
Okay.
would be the case. Yeah.
I was told by the OIT that you could use the shared drive for de-identified because I talked to them about the net files issue, and they said, oh, one solution is to put it on a shared drive, and I said, yes, I have that for university people, but you can't share the shared drive with people who are outside the university.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
But I think you can talk to the OIT guys, and they can give them a temporary authorization for a period of time when you're collaborating. So that might be like an option.
Okay.
But I would just like, okay. The guy that I know of is Mike Lingus, and he seems to be very interested in trying to figure out solutions. So, you know, worst comes to worst, maybe it's one of those things where it's like you just like call back and ask someone else. That's the customer service model that I always mentioned. You didn't get a good answer and you just call back and try someone else. Okay. Yes.
So I'm shaking my boots because
Oh no.
let's say hypothetically I have stored identified data before.
Yep.
Before it's been de-identified.
Sure.
I don't recognize any of those 4 ones on the left that have
Me
the green
too.
check.
Yeah.
And so I'm starting to wish that this camera wasn't rolling because, yeah, is
Yeah.
encrypted drive like that's bigger deal than like Excel? I can like lock a file so that it's password protected. I mean, it's
Yeah.
bigger than that.
Yeah.
So what's the easiest one of those to learn or figure out? What
Right.
direction would you point me so that I'm no longer
Yeah.
having identified data in a bad place?
Well, I mean, it sounds like you could use your shared drive, and also you can just contact LAT and they do like consultations, I think, on that. But my next slide is going to be about how you can encrypt your data. So you could also do that.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
So that will be the bottom one. Okay.
Yeah. So you can. There are various. If you guys mind if I advance
Yeah.
this slide? Oh wait, yeah. So this is just saying that the University of Minnesota has a standard for de-identification.
Right.
And there's a link there to like this is the short version. There are 19 things they want you to look for, and then you can read more about it through the link. But so you can go to this IT encryption stored data website, and they have suggestions for programs to do it. There are commercial programs, there are free ones, and they also say they'll happily talk to you and figure out like what program is the best. But you can get programs, and there are native programs in your Mac and your Windows that will encrypt your drive when it powers like off or goes to sleep, and then unencrypts it when you like open it up with your password. And then you can also just encrypt certain folders or certain files as well. So like for example, if you were to keep your list of like contact information along with your like transcripts, which might be a terrible idea, one way to do that in like a semi-safe-ish way would be to encrypt that file. Like I personally probably wouldn't want to have them anywhere near each other, but you could encrypt the file, right?
I just had the IT people encrypt a hard drive for me.
Okay, great. Yeah, so they can help you guys do that. I mean, I think fundamentally the university is really invested in making sure that you have storage and that your data is securely sort of stored. So like there are people whose literal jobs it is to like help you do that, right? All right, I'm gonna move on. Okay, so another PhD comic here. It's true. Have any of you guys lost data before?
Oh.
Yeah, it's like terrifying, right? Terrifying. Yeah. So there is the rule of 3 about storage and backup. So one of the things that comes with like really good data management practices is sort of making workable like workflows for yourself, and that can mean sort of making a plan for how and when you're going to store and save and back up your data. So maybe it's like once a week you're going to make sure that you've synced your data with an external hard drive and or like some external save point, which could be like your Google Drive, right? But yeah, so this is the rule of 3. You want 3 copies. So there's the working copy, the external but near, so that could be like an external hard drive or something like that. Do people even use writable CDs anymore? I don't know. And then external but far. Does anyone know why you want to have a copy of your data that's not in the same office as you?
You have a fire or something like that.
Right. Fire, floods, theft, earthquakes, zombie apocalypse. Any number of reasons why you might lose all of your data all at once, you know. So generally you want to think about having sort of redundancies involved. And most importantly, coming up with a plan that you will actually follow about consistently backing up your data.
Yeah, the problem is then you update one and then you don't update the others. Then it's kind of a
That's why you gotta be really good about it. I've been comparing like good data management practices to like flossing everyone knows you should do it, but it's not until you go to the dentist or lose all of your data when you are like, ooh, I should have flossed. So in a way, I'm really just encouraging you guys to like get in these really good habits and create these workflows. Like make it a part of doing research. A part of that is not just documenting your, you know, any sort of variable changes that you made, but also a part of that is like making sure you backed up your data, right? All right, cool. All right, and once your project's over and you want to archive your data, a good idea is to create a copy in these sort of really sort of long-lasting, interoperable file formats. So you lose a lot of formatting in some cases, especially when you're talking about saving data, like textual data is like .text or rich text files. And certainly, like if you have a really complex Excel file and you're like exporting all of those as like CSV or .tab, you lose a lot of sort of formatting and stuff. But you can open up a CSV file from 1991 today with no problems. You know what I mean? So I recommend at least keeping a copy of your data in these formats, also backed up across a couple different devices for the long term, because ultimately we want you to be able to open up your data in 6 months, in 10 years. SPSS may go bankrupt. We have no idea. So if you have your data in SPSS and you haven't been updating it as SPSS updates, so SPSS 50 may not be able to open up the SPSS today, right? So keeping a version of your data in these sort of formats that are non-proprietary and have sort of really good like fidelity across time is going to be important. Yeah.
Can I tell my favorite story about this?
Please do.
So there was a book that came out, I think, in the 1080s, called the Domesday Book. It was this little book, and it had all of this rich demographic data on like everyday life in England in the 11th century. So, you know, how many cows people had and all of this sort of thing. So 900 years later, the British government went on this big project, like celebrating like the Domesday Book, that we had this wonderful rich record. And so they went on, they did this like wild like multimedia project to like gather all of this great data on like everyday life in England through, you know, great mechanisms that were going to last forever, like laser discs.
Everyone has laser discs.
Yeah, we all have laser discs. Using a bunch of like, you know, up-to-date 80s technology. And preserving that information that was made like 20 years ago has been a way bigger headache and way more difficult than that book from 1080, which we still can read without a problem.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the, this is an aside, but this is one of the things they say about, you know, people like, oh, the end of the book with ebooks and tablets and phones and all of that. And it's like, yes, but a book doesn't run out of battery.
Yeah.
You know? So, like, you know, there's this persistent use of books, right? Because they are actually a really good technology. If you think of them as a technology, they're pretty useful. Apart from the fact that they can burn and be flooded, but so can all the other things that we're talking about, right? This is just a plea from me to you to think about the long-term preservation of your data and think about it as just like you would want to keep a record of any publications you've made. You want to keep a record as part of your sort of like history as a researcher. You want to keep those sort of files. Also, you know, that way you can then grandly donate it to some sort of, you know, archive and someone can study all your great works. It's really important. All right. Okay, and then I kind of talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but there are granting agencies that are requiring data management plans. So NSF is one of them, and these are generally what the NSF asks for when they ask you to create a data management plan. And as you can see, it's talking about a lot of the issues that we've already covered today. So this is just, I just throw this up here to show you guys what that looks like. We don't have to go through all of them because, well, I mean, now you can answer all these questions with great authority. And then also, NIH has what they call a data sharing plan, and this is what they ask for in that. I've included a link, but apparently I guess you're on your own for an SF. Actually, I have some. I think I have some links at the end. So I have a bunch of links and a couple extra slides at the end that you guys can peruse at your leisure. Okay, and then if you are going to be, if you know that you want to share your data, or if you are applying to some of these grants, you want to think about whether or not you are going to need IRB. And if you are, what you want to do is avoid restrictive language. So a lot of the default language, like on the IRB's website right now, kind of precludes this option of sharing. So you want to avoid that. And we have a couple examples for alternative language, which might because I think the IRB's stance is like, oh, you want to share that data? Okay, go reconsent everyone. So that is, and depending on how long your project is or how big your project is, that may not even be possible, right? And then you're stuck in where you're like, oh, now I have to try and extract this one person who I can't try and find and reconsent that data from the data set, right? So before you start, if you know that you might want to share your data, you want to build that into the consent form that you get past IRB and that you give to your respondents. Yeah.
And I put in extreme in my IRB applications. I have been very open that I plan to share the data everywhere.
Yeah.
And, this might be sent to other researchers. I'm not going to destroy it. And I haven't had any pushback.
Yeah,
from
and
that.
so the other thing to remember is that depending on what you're doing research on, some people might have no problem even being identified, right? As long as they know and sign off on it, right? So you could be talking to someone about their professional practices and about the social media use of CIOs or something, right? And they might be like, yeah, absolutely, you can, journalists get that kind of clearance all the time, right? So another thing to think about if you did want to really share your data, some people might not have a problem with you being identified, right? Something I kind of forget about because I think of de-identification confidentiality as being such an important part of getting sort of people to cooperate or volunteer or whatever. But depending on what you're researching, they may not care. But yeah, so you can check out that link for some alternative language. Super useful. All right, so what counts as sharing data? So if you are in a situation where you've been asked to share your data, there are a couple ways you can do it. You can go to a discipline-specific data repository. So ICPSR is huge. If you guys they've been around since the 60s. It's the Inter-Consortium of Political and Social Research or something like that. Don't quote me on that. Anyway, they've got insane amounts of data. And we are a member institution, so you have access to them. I think you just have to register at the site to get data from them. You can also put it into an institutional repository. So an example of that is DRUM, which is the data repository for the University of Minnesota, which I also work at. You could do it through a journal, supplementary materials. You could do it on a website. Or you could do it by a request, which has been sort of the standard way that data has been theoretically shared up until the emergence of these sort of data repositories and things. These are all ways that people say they will be sharing their data. I would suggest that you deposit your data into a data repository or an institutional repository. Websites need to be maintained, and if you're the one who's doing it, maybe you move institutions, something happens. Journals, I think, are trying to get out of the game of hosting those materials because it takes a lot of time and storage and expertise. And then, if your data is really sensitive and you want to control access to it, obviously you can do it by request. But there are restrictions that you can put on data in data repositories. So you can actually say, you can deposit it into ICPSR and say, okay, people need to get permission to use it and give them the conditions under which they can use it. You can also, if it's really sensitive data, do an enclaving, where essentially the person has to get clearance and then they never get a copy of the data. They sign into ICPSR's computers and do all their analysis and stuff on the computer, but not actually getting a copy of the data. So that's my pitch. Use a data repository or institutional repository because oftentimes they will commit to preserving your data, not just sharing your data. And you should check out their user agreements, and they should say that. And they should give you a DOI, so you can be cited too. Those are the things. I have a slide on it later at the end, after the thank you slide, which you guys can check out about things to look for if you're going to be depositing in a repository, sort of just marks of quality. Yeah, okay. Oh yeah, geez, I'm like going so over time, guys. I apologize. I'm going to rush through this, even though this is probably the really complicated stuff. So, so there was a data management policy that was put into effect in 2015. The long and the short of it is that the university owns all of your research. Is kind of what the long and the short of it is, and that that if you are employed by the university or a substantial amount of university resources was used to get your data, then they also own your data. And you can read more about that. Also,
But students own their academic, like our dissertation data is ours.
I think it's really fuzzy, but I don't think the university is. I wouldn't think the university would be coming after you for that. But I'm not sure. I think it's really fuzzy, to be honest. And I'm not a lawyer. Do you have an answer?
No.
Okay.
I've got a question. How
Okay.
about the collaboration? Like it's a
Oh, yeah.
project with another institution. How would
Yeah.
that work?
I'm not sure if maybe multiple institutions could own the data, because there's also because you can have multiple copyrights, you can have multiple copyright holders, but maybe it comes down to that whether or not there was a substantial portion of the resources used. So if all of the data is stored and the resources majoritively are being used here, then maybe they would have a claim. I'm not really sure, to be honest. Yeah, and then the other thing that the management policy talks about are what the PI's responsibilities are. And long story short, they essentially say, okay, the PI is responsible for the stewardship and preservation of the data, which includes sort of managing the access, meeting data security requirements, and there's this data classification system you can check out, whether or not the data is going to be shared and where it's going to be shared, and then, as I mentioned, preserving the data, or if it's required, to be destroyed, making sure it's destroyed. And also, they have this weird section where they're like, if you can't do this, then the college or school or campus has to help you do this. And if they can't do it, then the Office of Vice President of Research and the Office of Vice President of Chief Information Officer will help you do this. So in a way, they're making a commitment to sort of supporting the PIs if they are unable to fulfill these sort of requirements. And then you can request for your data to be transferred. So if you got a job at another university, you can request for your data to be moved.
So is this fairly typical? Is this the new standard, or?
I think the university owning your data is something that I'd run across in grad school and was really surprised about. But I also think it's I shouldn't be saying this while recording is happening. And I have no basis of this apart from just my hunch, but I think that I imagine that this would not be enforced unless there was some huge monetary thing involved. Although there, just recently in July, there was a case, really interesting. Maybe I can send it along to you. There was a case where a researcher who was at University of California, San Diego, moved his entire research lab to USC, and also his grant, or tried to take his grant, and pretty much UCSD sued and was like, nope, that data is ours, and they won. So it's an interesting case, and I can send you, there's an LA Times article about it. I can send it to you.
Who might we talk to at the University of Minnesota to get clarification on some of these data ownership issues?
Yeah, I am not super sure. Let me see. Let me open this up and see if there's a contact. Policy contact. I guess Frances Lawrence.
Huh.
Oh.
She's in our department.
Oh, well then that's perfect. You've got a inside scope there. Yeah, so maybe she can clarify that. Yeah, definitely. All right. Also, there's a copyright policy. So generally, you guys own a copyright, and there's an open access policy that also came out recently, which essentially, like some of these works, the university is also going to own a copyright, and that's to give you leverage when you're negotiating with journal articles, or for journals, so that you can negotiate to have like a preprint posted on your website or deposited into the institutional repository. So it's kind of to give faculty a little more leverage, hopefully, to negotiate a more favorable like copyright agreement with like these journals that might want to like restrict access. But yeah, so the university generally is not going to claim copyright on faculty-like employees and students. So what does copyright cover? So it's about original works that are fixed in a tangible medium of expression, right? And what it doesn't cover is any idea, procedure, process, system, method of operation, concept, principle, or discovery, regardless of the form in which it's described. And so, it also, just because it took a lot of, so what this means is like your data itself is not copyrightable. So if you went out and like took the temperature 3 times, like those temperature readings, you cannot copyright them. If you made a graph out of those temperature readings, you probably can copyright that. And the sweat of the brow doctrine essentially is saying if you hiked Mount Everest and took 3 temperature readings, despite the fact it took you a lot of effort to get those readings are still not copyrightable. If you made a graph out of those readings, you took a picture of yourself taking the temperature, that's copyrightable, but not the actual temperature itself. And we have a copyright librarian who's also a lawyer, Nancy Sims, and she has a really great video about these issues I highly recommend. And so, so generally, as I said, factual information, you can't copyright it. But any sort of charts or graphs that you guys create are copyrightable. Any figures, anything like that. And also, if you create an instrument like a survey, you could copyright that as well. So I've heard a story where some psychology students use some portion of a, what do they call them? Like when you have those like indexes or measures. Inventory, yeah, I used some portion of an inventory that had been published, but the person had copyrighted it. And so then the person who copyrighted it found out that she used it, and essentially she couldn't use that data because she hadn't asked for permission. Yeah, anyway, but it's really fuzzy, and it's tough. I'm not a lawyer. But Nancy Sims, the copyright librarian, is a lawyer, so give her a ring. Yeah. Oh, and then we do have a page about data and copyright. All right, sorry guys, I've gone so over, but thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Oh, thanks. And then yeah, here's the Z link again. So it's DMepsyCC. Yeah. Any questions? I mean, not that the data management policy and copyright is sticky, but yeah.
You alluded to that you have got some information about what sort of online services provision DOIs.
Oh, the provision DOIs?
Yeah.
I mean, data repositories can mint a DOI for you. Drum, or the institutional repository, can mint a DOI for you. But that is something that I don't think you can go out and do it yourself.
Okay.
Yeah, so you'd have to submit it to a repository that did that. But that's just one of the things you want to think about when you're choosing where to deposit your data. Because generally you want that DOI so someone can cite you. I mean, they could cite you if you don't have a DOI, but that really helps, it's like that permanent link, right, between the citation and the data. So definitely if you're going to be depositing, get a DOI. Yeah. I think I have so I have some resources there. Yeah, so this is like my little checklist of things you want to think about before you deposit. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, cool. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you
Appreciate
so
it.
much.
Happy-
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, and like I said, there's a bunch of resources here too, so